Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this roundtable governing online content. I'm super happy to see the room being full, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people are watching us online. So welcome to all the participants, welcome to all the speakers, welcome to our guests. I'm very, very happy and very proud to be moderating this roundtable with so many great minds around the table. I know now quite well most of them. I'm discovering news, and I can't wait to hear what all of you have to bring on the table. As a little word of introduction, we have now 5 billion of social media users. That's what was reported in 2022. This is an incredible expansion of the scope of the online public sphere. It goes with some new challenges, and the very broad intersubjectivity that it brings creates these challenges. While the issue of content and regulation isn't new, newspaper, radio, the question of freedom of expression has been on the first place of the debate for years and years now. The velocity, the volume, the transnational context of this circulation of content is new. And we have now to face the consequences of sometime unregulated space of online freedom of expression. This is why the regulation of online content cannot be dealt only within nations. And I believe this is one of the big statements that we have to do as a beginning. And this is why this roundtable is with people from so many different countries. This is a challenge we have to face together, despite our nation, despite our region, despite... Oh, okay, that's fine. While national borders, regional borders cannot work and make this content regulation within the walls anymore, the Paris Peace Forum launched this initiative after 1 year, and exactly 1 year, at the Paris Peace Forum, a last roundtable based on to harm and not to harm, defining harmful content. After this great roundtable years ago, they decided that the discussion should be continued toward the year, and they gather guests for a year of workshops based on this question of governing online content. A white paper has now been published. I really recommend all of you to read it. It's pretty brilliant. And these have been discussed and decided and agreemented through workshops during the year from people all around the world, from Cameroon to India, to people in the US, to people in France. And I'm super proud I could take part of this amazing discussion. Now, in order to present this white paper, deepen the question and try to find solution, because this is, again, a solution-oriented discussion, I'm super happy to welcome all of you. So I'll do a very, very quick roundtable with who's around the table. I'll try to stay quick because we have a short amount of time and a lot of things to discuss. So we have with us Apa Gupta from the Internet Freedom Foundation. We have David Sullivan from the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership. We have Jeep Albers from the Nordic Safe City. We have David Rides from the UK Safer Internet Centre, Rebecca McKinnon from the Wikimedia Foundation, Peggy Hicks from the Director of the Thematic Engagement, Special Procedures and Right to Development Division at the UN Human Rights Office. We have Marta Gutierrez, Director of Global Division Global Policy from GYZ. We have Chris Gray, author and activist, ex-moderator. We have Selina Bottino from ETS Rio de Janeiro. We have Matt Finneman from the Denmark's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we have Jan Gerlach from the Wikimedia Foundation. Hopefully we'll be joined by Agustina Del Campo from the Universitat de Palermo, who cannot be with us today in person, but who was a great contributor of the white paper and the discussion. Let's start. I'm going to give you the floors, one after the other, on two specific topics. Please mind the fact that a lot of people are on the table, and we want to hear which one of you. So please, every discussion, every discourse should not last more than 3 minutes, if you may. We're going to start with the question of harmful content as a governance issue. This is something we've been working in the report, and this is something I would like to hear your thoughts on. I'm going to start with you, Apa. On the question of harmful content, and with all the discussion and the great work we're doing in the report, What's your take about it?
So the way we approached harmful content, I think, initially was centered around its understanding of how the framework would work in Europe and North America. But when we came to contexts such as South Asia, we realized that a taxonomic-based approach in which what does harmful mean by itself, which is not legal, was not particularly also a useful framework. So context is important. Geographical context is important. And what I mean by this is that the practiced democratic system in a country, as well as the rule of law framework, is a very important determinant how harmful will be practiced. I say this from experience as a lawyer who worked on a constitutional challenge in 2013 on a case which is possibly India's leading case on digital rights. It's called Shreya Singhal versus Union of India, in which there were vague phrases which showed also the state's encounter with the internet and its inability to regulate it properly, such as offensive, annoying, not harmful, but phrases even grossly offensive, which were undefined, and which led to a lot of people being criminally prosecuted and sent to jail. The Supreme Court struck it down as being unconstitutional because the underlying phrases itself were not defined. But what put into focus was that people who were protesting against politicians, exposing corruption, they were the ones who were being prosecuted more. So I think that South Asian focus, which is especially present and has been noted in the white paper, is important, and I think will mark a very clear distinction as to how frameworks are developing. The second part of the paper where I think this reflection becomes much more evident is that the framework is emerging from legislations or regulations which are listed in a tabular form. And if you notice that the regulations, except Singapore, happen to be based in Europe or North America. So that itself shows that sometimes the harmful yet legal framework may not itself be such a useful solution set to content regulation in other jurisdictions.
Thank you so much, and we'll come back on this question of geography and languages. Peggy Hicks, on the human rights point of view, how can you describe and how do you address this question of harmful content?
Pointing out part of what we have to avoid. So I think we now know enough to know some of the do's and don'ts of harmful content. And the reality is that a strong push to just solve this problem will lead to solutions that violate fundamental rights and will be used against those who are actively working, dissenting, engaging, and making societies better. So we have to get this right. And that means that we can't have this broad, overbroad legislation and put that on the table. What we know about what works is that we need to look for transparency, and we need to learn from what that transparency tells us. So we need to find ways to make sure that both companies and governments are reporting on this, and looking at Rebecca and knowing that she'll come in with more ideas on this going forward. But only through that transparency can we really hold companies accountable, users accountable that are misusing the platforms in different ways. At the same time, this idea that there isn't one size that fits all across all geographic jurisdictions, I both agree and disagree to some extent. I agree absolutely that if we're going to solve these problems, we need to invest in understanding the local context and making sure that there are resources there and making sure that the solutions are ones that respect what is happening in a local context and are able to be done in local languages. At the same time, we do have to have overarching principles that govern what we're looking at there. And those I do think are universal. We're about to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it's an incredible tool for us to actually bring the world together around these issues. It will help us solve the issues of harmful content if we engage with it in the right way. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And this is perfect you mentioned Rebecca, because Rebecca, I wanted to ask you for you to go deeper on what's happening on the harmful content? Where are we now? Like what kind of legislation does already exist? What kind of governance is in process? And where are we now in order to go in a better direction, maybe?
Well, thanks so much, Leila, and thanks for inviting us to have this important conversation. I do think the internet and the ecosystem of platforms online is at a watershed moment. And we need to make sure that as government regulators are thinking about how to regulate the internet, but also as other multi-stakeholder, non-governmental initiatives work to think about how to address harms and problems on the internet and to protect human rights, that we think not just about how do we solve for the harms of today that are exacerbated by a specific set of commercial platforms, specific business models. Obviously, that's a concern. But how do we both legislate and regulate, but also build mechanisms of accountability for human rights and for the ability of everyone around the world to participate online and to share knowledge freely across borders? How do we regulate and legislate and create frameworks of accountability that build the internet we want for the future, not just sort of focus on the current issues today? And how do we make sure we don't entrench models of content moderation that happen to be dominant today, but there might be other alternatives, which brings me to the Wikimedia decentralized model of content moderation and some of the concerns that we're bumping up against with regulation. Now, the Wikimedia Foundation is a nonprofit organization that is host of Wikipedia and 300 different language versions of Wikipedia, governed by volunteers, both edited and governed by volunteers. So it's the volunteers that set the rules for what is credible and reliable content on pages on their language Wikipedia. So English language Wikipedia is not, governed just by people in the UK or the United States, but is English speakers all over the world. So what is considered harmful in the UK, what is considered harmful by English speakers in India or some other place, it varies, right? It's very contextual. And so how do you empower communities who, depending on what the content is, maybe it's about a movie star in India or a region in Bangladesh, how does an English speaker in the West, understand the context around harm in specific languages too, not just even in English, right? Only the people who are local to that content and affected by the relevant content are in the best position to understand what is harmful and how to set rules around enforcing against harms, or whether it's what is truthful and what is not, right? Which is interconnected. But as Peggy says, you also need common human rights standards. So you want to make sure that communities, if a community has a right to develop its own platform for its own purposes and set rules of governance of the content on that platform, of course, it is reasonable to expect that community respects the human rights of its users, right? And
exactly the
so,
second point of where we're going.
So just to speak to a suggestion, and I thought there were many things about this paper that are really good and that I agree with. But one concern I have is about developing taxonomies of harmful content or some kind of global body that's determining harmful content. And I would caution against that. I mean, just based on our own experience, that will result in people in the rich Western countries dominating how the rules work. Just inevitably, no matter how hard you try to be inclusive. But at the same time, Wikimedia Foundation, our board has adopted a global human rights policy. We're working with the community to make sure that human rights are protected and respected across our platforms. The community has a global code of conduct. And so there are common standards of respect for human rights, respect for, certain conduct that are appropriate, but that I would suggest focusing more on impact assessment, on accountability and transparency mechanisms, rather than focusing on trying to define what is harmful globally, or kind of what the enforcement mechanisms should be globally, because I don't think that will work. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. And it's duly noted, because this is exactly the point of the debate. Like, how can we create a global framework without putting everyone behind one point of view, and we're like keeping specificity respected. And this is why I'm opening the debate now on that specific topic, and I would like to start with Mustara Shaikham from the Ofcom on exactly this point. How should we take the legal notion of harmful but lawful and implement it in the very complex notion from the regulator, from the point of view? What should we do with this specific notion that does exist, but we still have a hard time dealing with it, especially in the light of what Rebecca just said?
Thank you. We happen to be in a situation where we're actually already the online safety regulator in the UK, regulating video sharing platforms established in the UK, and preparing for hopefully the draft online safety bill coming into force next year. And I'd say the first thing to say before I say anything is that the bill is the creation of the government. We are the independent regulator that's been assigned to implement it. But I can try to explain what the policy intent there is. And I think the core of the bill, and therefore the regime, is to define harm by what's illegal, and to set out some priority categories of illegal content, which right now amount to around 15 buckets of offences, numbering over 40. The bill also has elements to it which are commonly referred to as legal but harmful. And for now, they remain in the bill. And the way they're meant to be applied is not in a standardized fashion. Those bits of the bill are meant to be applied in a way that platforms are held to account to what their own terms and conditions are, and to enforce them. And for us to hold them to account with multiple regulatory levers, including transparency, risk assessment reports, and so on. So yeah, that's how it's defined. I think there is a very difficult, contested philosophical and legal question here that we need to deal with, which is whether, on one end, do we deal with harm in a subjective way, as in do we defer to the person being harmed or the communities being harmed, or do we refer to it in an objective way? And I think we're trapped somewhere in the middle, and we keep sort of yo-yoing. And when you sort of expand that problem on a global scale, then it creates further problems, which have already been raised. And I'll just end by saying that, prior to joining Ofcom, I was an advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on minority issues. And ultimately, if we're going to be looking for a global solution, it has to be one that's based in international human rights standards. And I think something that people sometimes mischaracterize or don't fully understand is that freedom of expression is just one side of the balance, as it were. The other side is human rights also tells you a lot about harm, and the communities that are harmed, in particular minorities and other protected groups.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to give the floor to Marta from the Human Rights. Please keep your answer very short, because I would like to give the floor as well to people who didn't have the occasion to speak yet. Thank you so much.
I will. Thank you. I just have to apologize because there's a long German name in my my title. Nobody knows what that is. That is the German Agency for International Cooperation, which is basically advise governments on policies, but also implement large-scale solutions in the global south, so that you don't take out your dictionary. So, because we are dealing with such a sensitive issue, I think what we have to agree on is the process to get to a place where we can agree on some common principles and common values. This has to be a very transparent way. And I think there are three issues here at stake. First of all, that we know that what we do from now on has to be extremely effective. That means it has to lead somewhere, to some decision-making at international level. And this is, on one side, the Global Digital Compact, which is going to be defined in September next year. So we really have a place there where we can bring up these issues. But also we have to invest in mobilizing national governments, especially in countries in Europe or the US, to actually pass on legislation that agrees to harmonizing rules internationally. And the German government just did that. They say, we're going to harmonize, and secondly, we're going to support the digital sovereignty of countries, especially in the global south, and their autonomous decision-making. So this is really important. And the second point is tap on conversations that are happening regionally already. African Union, Latin America, they already have this kind of conversation. So instead of just inviting them, invest in the next year for them to prepare really informed and consulted positions in order to bring them up. And that's the last point, to just make sure that you converse with projects on the ground because they know what works or what doesn't work. Thank you.
This is a perfect transition to actually give the floor to Agustina Del Campo that just joins us online. Agustina, do you hear us? Would you like to react and explain from your specific area how you tackle this question of harmful content and how you try to make that specific area exist and make sense in the global trial of solution we're trying to create, and how you really address this issue from a local as well as an international point of view, and how this discussion happen.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you perfect.
Okay. So from a Latin American point of view, I think it's interesting at least to bear in mind that we don't have any kind of immunity laws. The kind of laws that were passed in Europe or in the United States with Section 230 and with the European e-commerce directive, they were accepted by the jurisprudence in Latin America, but they were not really adopted as the legislative standard in the region. And so maybe that's partly the reason why our courts in Latin America are not necessarily speaking of harmful but legal. They are speaking of judicial notice. They're speaking of harm within a context of law and not harm within a context of ethics or of morals or a subjective definition of harm. And I think that is particularly interesting for the global conversation that we're seeing arising in different bills around the world that start discussing the issue of content and harm somewhat out of the legal context. I think it's an interesting way of looking at the differences. When we look at harm from the jurisprudence in Latin America, from the Constitutional Court in Colombia, from the Supreme Court in Argentina, in Chile, in Mexico, we're looking at harm as one element of civil liability. And I say one because it's only one. There's intention, there's causation, there's a number of other elements that come into the equation. And Personally, from looking at different legislations that are arising in different contexts, particularly in countries that have adopted immunity systems, is that the harmful element is coming somewhat outside of the current legal structure that they're considering. So we start adopting this concept of harmful but legal, somewhat taking the harm outside of the legal analyses and analyzing harm as an absolute thing, which from a freedom of expression perspective, I think it's particularly dangerous. We have globally adopted and negotiated a series of standards, and we found some equilibrium that might be better for some situations and worse for others, but it is the equilibrium that we have found, what to protect and what not to protect, and what to prosecute and what not to prosecute. My fear in focusing the conversation from a point of view of harm is that we are pushing new balances and trying to strike new balances outside of the traditional legal framework where the boundaries and the legitimate limits to freedom of expression have been defined so far. And we're asking companies to do that, which I think gives them an enormous amount of power on the one hand, and additionally, an enormous amount of responsibility for basically what can and cannot be said in our new public square with this new rules that are to be defined outside the law and outside the democratic state and within a company.
Thank you so much, Agustina. And I think we will come back on what you say in the second part. Before switching to the second part of the debate, before actually tackling the solution, and a lot of first ideas have been given around the table, I would like to go on the ground, as you said, of how harmful circulate and how we moderate it. And we have with us Chris Gray, who used to be a moderator, and I've seen everything we've been talking from the other side, if I may say, on what has been working and what has not been working so far, on what you have seen on the circulation of harmful and the impact from the law, and is the law, tackling the right issues. As an ex-moderator and now someone who try to get the word out, how do you rely to everything that has been said, and how, from the ground perspective, you can maybe add something and let us know how it does happen?
Sure. Am I on? Okay, so as we said, I'm the guy whose job is to sit there and actually press the button and say, this is harmful, we're going to take it away. And between the laws and the policies that are being discussed here and my job, there's a huge gap which nobody seems interested in, which is that I will have a reference document defining harm. I've got that taxonomy of what is going to be harmful and what isn't. And nobody's asking where that comes from, how it's created, or what it looks like. So I've heard a lot of people talk about transparency. Let's just go to one of these big platforms and say, give me a copy of your in-house rules, the detailed rule, not the community standards that Facebook publishes, the document that the community standards is based on. And then let's see all the old versions of that. And every time you publish an update, which is every 2 weeks, there's a policy update, you have to send a copy to us, to I don't know, to governments, to some supervisory authority, even to the oversight board. As far as I know, the oversight board have never seen that document either. Oh.
That was short but impactful, if I may say. I think the way you tackle the question of transparency, because it comes back, and in order to move forward to the second part of the debate, I feel, and I might be mistaken, that we have actually two questions. What is it, and who decide? And these two questions kind of like make this very complicated dance together, because who decide to apply the rule, who decide the rule, who decide how they should be reinvented and reapplied, and then what are the rules? And should we have like common rules? And we have kind of like this correlation between what and who that is very, very complicated to tackle. In order to tackling harmful content, now let's focus on the solution. What path forward for better multi-stakeholder coordination in this regard? And we'll start with SK Winter Jensen from the Nordic Safe City. If you might give us a beginning of perspective on that topic.
Thank you very much. I don't know if Chris is the guy pushing the button. I have no idea who I am, but anyways, I'm very happy to be here and thanks for inviting us. I'm here on behalf of a project called Safe Digital City, and I'm going to talk about how we, in practical terms, can tackle online hate, how we can prevent, how we can curb the harm that online hate extremism inflicts on our societies. And I'm going to talk about how cities can actually tackle online hate themselves with with the resources that they already have at their disposal today. I mean, the question is, how can we bring school teachers, police, social workers, civil society, citizens as bystanders into the fight against online hate and extremism? And how do we take their offline experiences and bring them into the online world? I mean, that's the question that, in practical terms, the Safe Digital City project has tried to solve and has actually been quite successful in solving. Because the thing is that until now, it has been extremely difficult for cities to actually engage in that fight against online hate and extremism. Where is it? How much is there? Who's behind? Who's being targeted? What can we do? Now, this is actually why we developed the Safe Digital City concept, because it does two things. It locates hate, online harm, and extremism, racism, on a city level across social media platforms, and it engages the local society in actually tackling the problems. So we do two things in this project. First, I mean, I can give you all sorts of techie stuff, but that's not really of interest here, but we've developed hate recognition algorithms in Scandinavian main languages, and we use social media analysis to map the digital city's problems. Where's the hate? Who are the targets? When does it peak? Why does it peak? What are the social dynamics behind this? First, that's the first thing. The second thing is, then we bring in the municipality, police officers, school teachers, social workers, to actually understand what goes on in the city and to design and implement, ways to tackle it. In the Swedish city of Malmö, basically we've been mapping extremism and hate online there for more than a year. And the city has not only, the entire municipal board and local politicians have agreed to engage in this fight, to be at the forefront of this fight. They have agreed on moderating principles on their own social media platforms and pages. And they also have, adopted and implemented, or are in the way of implementing a digital intervention team that they can actually send out in times of trouble, and the police is getting ready to go online. Even more important, we have actually, in concrete and specific circumstances, we have de-escalated and even defused attempts by right-wing extremists to incite hatred against certain ethnic minorities, both off and online. And, well, it's actually not we who did that, but it's civil society in Malmö that through this project were aware of where to engage, how to engage, and what digital de-escalation actually means. Right now, we're working in 3 cities in Denmark, Norway, and in Sweden, and we're expanding to a number of cities next year. And at least my hope is that this very practical, on the boots ground approach can inspire other cities and actors to engage.
Thank you so much. So it's really trying to have, in order to address this very global solution, trying to focus on something that on the field is actually trying to have a success and how we can scale it. And it goes with what Rebecca was saying. We can find solution on the ground. Now the question is how to scale it and how to inspire other regions that maybe didn't took part in the debate in the first place. And we go back to the question of should we have a global framework? On that topic and on the part, so you were on the part of the civil society and cities engagement. I would like to hear from David Sullivan, the industrial part, like from the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, what industries, what private actors can have in complementarity and maybe sometimes different regards to the question, how do you tackle this subject of harmful content?
Thanks, Leila. So I work with a wide variety of digital companies offering different types of products and services, different business models, coming together around a common approach to trust and safety, which is based on practices rather than content standards. And I think it speaks to the importance of the context and the difficulty of trying to capture the wide variety of harmful content that is out there, and perhaps the futility of trying to invent the perfect taxonomy. I think in the last couple of days, I've heard some powerful statements about different types of harmful but legal content out there. David Wright, during a session yesterday, spoke to the Molly Russell inquest and self-harm materials in the UK. Speaking to Ambassador Henri Verdier, he mentioned the coup d'etat in Burkina Faso and rumors spreading online about the president being in the French embassy, leading to attacks there. Those are both examples of legal but harmful content that could not be more different. And those are just, a drop in the ocean of content that in different contexts, with different products, different services, could be considered harmful. So rather than trying to address all of these things through some sort of taxonomy that then could be, frankly, selectively enforced through intervention by governments with companies and without the voices of the people who are most affected, involved in the creation of these processes, I think an alternative approach is to say, let's look at the practices that companies are using that are appropriate to their products, that are based on the risks that those products and services actually entail, to look in more detail, not just at the standards, which is an incredibly important part that Chris spoke to, which is kind of like the recipe for, but it's also like everything that goes into how you create the product or service. How does product development work? What are the rules? How are those rules enforced? Do companies have processes and practices to improve them? And how can they specifically be transparent with users so we get that check from civil society, from policymakers, and what have you. So I think this practices approach, it's inspired in some ways by practices and standards that have developed in cybersecurity, where you have international standards. It's a different way of coming at these things than through regulation that I think sometimes can create skewed incentives. But I would offer it as an example and happy to talk to everyone here more about that.
Thank you so much. And on the solution point of view, so we had what the private sector can do, what civic societies can do. And I would like to give the floor to Celina Bottino from ETS in Rio de Janeiro, because I believe you've been working on a bot system on how to prevent the expansion of bot. And this is, in a different way, a very concrete way to actually try to tackle the harmful content online. So maybe you could tell us more about what you've been doing.
Sure. Well, so yeah, I think in the side of solution, ITES is contributing to this debate, I would say, with one example would be our Pegabot tool, which is Catch the Bot, which is an online system that algorithm that works to try and identify the probability of a specific handle be a bot or not on Twitter. And then we use this by looking at profile pictures, the number of tweets, also the network, and also the content. It's a positive, negative language that's being used. It's just so to explain And then we do analysis of specific like hashtags to try and give more information of what's going on online. And we've partnered with civil society, not only civil society, with journalists, and also with the electoral court in Brazil during elections right now. They asked our help to try and identify once like specific hashtags were up, if they were or not being promoted by bots. So this helps to bring more transparency to the debate, and also to give information on what's going on. And with this, we can also like scale up to another and give information for people that are being like victims of these online attacks, to pursue, to go to justice, or to do other, like to move forward. So this is like one specific tool, let's say, that can be also scaled up and has been used and helped, for example, journalists. We did a partnership with Reporters Without Borders and find out the attacks on specific, that attacks were greater on women journalists. So, and we analyzed more like 500,000 of tweets. So it's been used around also many people being adopted. And for now, it's only in Portuguese and Spanish, but we're seeking to expand the language. So because we know that that's very also context-based. So.
Yeah, and the question of the language is a big question that maybe it could be good to discuss a little bit further. I would now to give the floor to Mette Finneman from the Danish embassy. You've been really working on gathering government, because there is this question of solution that can be found on the ground, on the floor, but also how can government who is in charge of this population can really like make sure that these efforts really go until the button that Chris is pushing, And so maybe from, more like a policymaker perspective, how do they work together on that specific topic, and how can we bring them together more with the civil society as well, and try to fuel these policymakers with everything that we hear now?
Yeah, thank you so much, Leila, and thank you for having me in this panel with very distinguished colleagues. I get almost intimidated by all the very great actions around the table, especially as being a policymaker. I think it's very important to say, as a policymaker, being inspired, being observant of the civil society is key. And maybe taking a step back from the Danish government side, looking at approaches to policy making in technology, that's exactly what you need to do. And I would say that there's a realization among governments that for the past decade, we haven't really done enough. On the positive side, I'd say that we're also starting to see governments across the world really realizing and waking up and saying, okay, we actually do need to make a framework. We do need to sort of put out the rules of the road. And I'd say that there's been a variety of things that the public sector have done already or about to do. One is to say, okay, how can we make regulation in this space? And the European Union and the DSA is a very good example of that, and on content regulation. And because it's so important to set standards, not only for member states, but also something that can inspire globally, being very mindful that it's not replicated and misused, obviously. Secondly, there's a question of how we incentivize behavior and how we incentivize good behavior. And then thirdly, because we're dealing with a transnational issue, often tied to some of the biggest companies, it's also something that we need to deal with a bit differently. One is to regulate, one is to incentivize, and the third one is around public-private partnerships. And that is something that we've been doing through the Danish government initiative, Tech for Democracy, that we actually launched just around this time last year. And it's about also inviting people in and saying, look, we're not going to get regulation maybe perfect tomorrow, but we do need to work together in order to find some common ground, as Marta said, some common values, some common collaboration around pieces on how to make the internet more safe, more reliable, and secure. So there's a lot of things that can be done through legislation. And I would say restricted national measures cannot deliver on everything. Tackling harmful content or tackling disinformation, for example. That's also about digital literacy. It's also about equipping citizens. And it's about working with sectors globally. So what the Tech for Democracy initiative have been doing the past year is bringing in the tech companies, different governments, multilateral organization, as well as meaningful civil society participation in order to develop these. I'm happy to share more around the action coalitions, but I also just wanted to note that going around the Paris Peace Forum and a lot of the solutions that are on the ground here from a lot of civil society actors are really, really inspiring. And I hope that all government representatives around here will find inspiration in them as well. Thank you, Leila.
Thank you so much. And I would like to open a more freely discussion because a lot of things have been said and a lot of things that sometimes cannot combine or sometimes kind of oppose themselves. And this is exactly why it's important to keep discuss about it. So what I would like to go deeper in is this question of harmful. We know that harms happen. We don't know really how to describe them. Should we have standards? Who should make the standards? Because it's not that much that we are against standards. It's more that who's in charge of making the standard and how can we make sure that they stay, you know, like up to the point of society and they evolve with society. So I would like to go a little bit more into who make the rules, the question of multi-stakeholder approach and how the people who make the rule actually engage in real meaningful discussion with societies rather than sometimes sporadic consultation that might not really like give them the voice. So I would like to go into that. And then from this who make the rule, how can we close the gap between, even if standards are being made, implementation and then verification of the fact that these standards actually does go until the very bottom, you know, that we expressed before. So how can we really like try, even if you have like big standards, to make them more created in a decentralized way with a multi-stakeholder approach? And how, once we make up with these standards, can we close this gap to make sure that the standards actually goes until the very last minute of decision, which question the part of algorithm and the part of human part in this moderation. So a lot of big topic, but I would like to open the floor and make people able to react to what has been said and go deeper in the two sides. So who would like to start? Peggy, be my guest.
Thanks. No, it's a tough question. We've heard a lot. I mean, I think the starting point, unfortunately, is everybody's making the rules. And in a way, that's the right answer, in that we actually need everybody to come together to create the ecosystem that we're talking about that will be a rights-respecting, free and open internet. But the real question is not who are they, but what roles do each of them play within that ecosystem. So what we need from government. We need government to help set the framework that holds companies accountable for what their roles are within the space and to encourage the right types of innovation, the right types of practices that will create the internet we want. And that may mean, you know, pushing towards mandatory human rights due diligence, the standards within the DSA that allow the multi-tier approach to what are different companies, different levels of responsibility, I think make a lot of sense. But we need the governments to set that framework in terms of transparency and accountability. But in my view, we don't want governments to go further and start being the ones that are making some of the specific decisions on content, because I think ultimately we've seen that that path leads to places from a democratic standpoint we don't want to go. Then that leads to the companies. What do we really expect from them? And I think, again, we have to recognize that while we spend a lot of time talking about the big players, and they are, you know, incredibly influential, we are getting to a place where there are a lot of other players, and we may, if things go as many want, be in a place where we have a more decentralized approach to some of what's happening too. So I think we need a more sophisticated conversation as well about, you know, going beyond it's the business model to actually what types of things we expect from companies. We say we don't We want to look at things like amplification and all the other different ways governments can respond to companies can respond to bad content. There's a toolbox there, and we need to set standards for how they do it. I think we also should be setting standards for what level of investment companies need when they're going into different contexts and in different languages. It should be part of doing business that you can't be in a place that has a language like Urdu that's spoken by tens of millions of people and not have your community standards in Urdu. That doesn't make any sense. So set some benchmarks and standards along that line as well. I also think we need to look more to the industry itself, to not have each company doing it on their own, and some baseline things that are accountable and that they commit to and that are enforceable through co-regulation will really help. And then the rest of us need the space to hold both governments and companies accountable. And that means civil society, which are going to be the voices that will tell us, we don't have all the answers here. We have to look at what happens and monitor it and figure out what's working and what isn't. And we need civil society to be able to push back when we've gotten things wrong, and to push for us to make the improvements that I'm sure will be needed, because even the best piece of legislation today will not predict either what works or where we're going, because things continue to evolve. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, please, Apa, you can react to that.
Peggy, thank you so much for that really prudent intervention. It makes a lot of sense, even in jurisdictions like India, because quite often where we've seen accountability come from has been the friction between companies and the government by itself. And that's when sometimes users end up gaining a higher degree of insight, and there's some accountability which does flow. So there's a power which comes to the individual or to a community ultimately. I think a very important part of that is transparency. And what transparency also means quite sometimes is not only the content moderation guidelines now, because the majority of the content moderation, as per the company's own claims, are being done automatically, and not only a basis of comments, but proactively. And I think also in terms of language classifiers and also in terms of the organization, whether the local policy team can influence a content moderation decision to benefit the company's commercial operation or even for its safety, as has been noted in some contexts, is important. It's also important to pick up on how much financing is being done on content moderation in different geographies, as the Horgan disclosures have shown. So I just wanted to build on that. I think transparency is really important, and that's a great starting point. Even as we keep debating what is harmful or who sets the rules, it's something which we will all benefit and discover, be more informed about this subject.
Thank you, Apa. And I would just say, before going back to someone else, I would like to hear a word from David Wright. Especially, I don't know what part you wanted to react, but I would like also to hear from you how we can measure the effect of these arms on the real world, if now even like completely merged together. Because I feel like sometimes the moment where government has to step in depends on the actual harm. So maybe you could give us some explanation.
Leila, thank you very much. It's great listening to the debate, and it's wonderful. Thank you for the invitation to join the panel too. So I'm CEO of a UK charity, and I'm SWGFL. I'm director of the UK Safer Internet Centre. So we're one of 32 European Safer Internet Centres and worked in this space for 2 decades. We operate 3 helplines, and that's really what I want to inject into the conversation. So we directly and indirectly support victims of harm online in the UK. And so one, for example, is the Revenge Porn Helpline, which is a terrible title. We support adults who are victims of non-consensual intimate image abuse. And every day we see harm occurring to those particular adults. There's quite rightly a lot of focus on children, and indeed violence against women and girls. We see that all the time. But we equally see harms against adults, and disproportionately women as well. Last year we supported 4,500. Of which, and this is the thing I want to inject, it's great having the debate. I would ask that debate is accelerated. I know there's talk within the online safety bill of removing legal but harmful, and I think all that does is it merely kicks the can down the road. On behalf of the victims that we serve each and every day, suffering harm, 4% of those we support are suicidal in terms of the catastrophe that befalls them having their images shared online without any control. In fact, that's one of the reasons that I'm here representing a selective project, Stop NCII, so the world's first device-side hashing technology that will allow victims to create an identifier of a particular image, to upload and to share that identifier, that fingerprint onto social media, so initially Facebook and Instagram, to prevent that image from being uploaded anywhere in the world, which returns the power to the hand of the victim here, those in those unfortunate circumstances. So there are examples around, but like I say, I would really like to inject some urgency into this conversation. We can't just keep talking and talking about it. We need some progress, people.
Thank you for joining and for reminding that. I believe Marta wanted to have a quick word. I just want to we have less than 5 minutes left, so if we can keep the discussion circulate, that would be great. Please, Marta, have... Oh, well, then she passed on David, so please, David.
I'll be very brief. I just think it's also important when we're gathered at these kinds of forums that the conversations going on in different sessions kind of reinforce one another, that we don't lose track of things. So I think many of us were downstairs talking about disinformation and the vital role of media freedom and journalism to deal with threats to democracy around the world. And I think one thing to be aware of is if we try to push towards too homogenous a view of what is harmful content, the risk that could disincentivize digital products or services from hosting challenging content that might be vital for journalistic purposes. So I did just want to make sure that we take note of that in thinking about this issue.
And maybe on that topic, Marta, you can move forward and then, yeah.
Thank you. Also, a 30-second intervention. When we're talking about multi-stakeholders processes, it's very important that we think about how to strengthen the capacity of governments in the global south to play their role. You did say very clearly what we expect from governments, but not all governments can do that. And sometimes we see the situation on the ground that the civil societies are much better connected and much more aware of what's happening than what actually governments can do. So part of this multi-stakeholder approach is just to strengthen the capacities of governments in the global south to be able to take up this role.
Thank you so much for that. Murtada, do you want to take the floor?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I was going to say that sometimes talking about substantive standards can be a bit of a distraction. I think ultimately they will be decided by platforms, they will be decided by governments. But what there seems to be consensus on here is that companies doing their own risk assessments and improving their transparency reporting is essential. And I think no one's disagreed with that. The only point I'd add to that is there's a big difference to that happening by the company itself and it being compelled by a regulator or a government. Just recently, last month, we published our first transparency report into video sharing platforms, and that was quite monumental, not because of what it had inside it, but because it was the first time companies had to provide that information.
Thank you. Maybe a mistake. I thought Jan putting your sign. Okay, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to actually maybe put a bow on all of these things that were just said over here. Standards on harmful content are very, very hard for platforms to even know what they are. There's on our legal team at the Wikimedia Foundation, there's a joke about the online safety bill in the UK that we don't know whether we can host the article, the Wikipedia article about Santa Claus, because it might be harmful to children. Now, this is, of course, not a... Yeah, something lighthearted maybe at the end of the panel here, but it's really hard to know. And often, of course, that is an easy excuse that tech platforms often sort of give, right? It's complicated, but it really is in this case. The other thing that I wanted to point out is that we've been talking about multi-stakeholderism, empowering governments, listening to communities, which is important, listening to civil society. But I also want to bring up civil society also builds tools and platforms. And whenever we go to a conference, I tick the box civil society, not tech platform or something like that. And governments really need to invest in civil society to do these things, to build infrastructure, to actually help with content moderation. Public editor, hold your hand up, great work. There's lots of important work being done by civil society beyond just adding comments to a consultation, right? And that needs to happen much more, but it needs much more investment, and that is money. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And it goes with the question again, how do we give them the floor, but as well like some kind of power to really step in and have an impact? I saw Chris wanted to add something.
Yeah, final comment. I spent a year pressing the button and it hasn't made any difference. And the number of people doing the work has increased. And then I see all these people here doing something. And I think we just have to stop asking big tech to solve the problem. They're not going to do it. They can't, because they're fixated on one way of doing things, which is the opposite of the Silicon Valley model. We should have loads of people trying loads of different things and support them, as we said.
Thank you for that. Did anyone wanted to add something, or or should we close the question? I just want to give everyone the opportunity to actually speak up for the different speakers around the table. We time out, so I'm going to give some to the speaker, but if we start asking questions, that would be amazing, but we really time out. So thank you so much all for being here. What I can definitely say is the conclusion of the progress report that people around the table have been working for a year now on the harmful content will be posted today on the Parapeace Forum website. So I really invite all of you to read it. It's very, very rich, really, really good. And I hope this report is going to grow in the following year, and I hope this content group of discussion is not done. So I would like to say to all of you, thank you, and see you next year.